That Handsome Boy. Written by Simba the Savage 8. Narrated by me, Touch the Grave. Yeah, I just got a new roommate. Phoebe. Yeah. She moved in last Saturday. She reminded me a lot of myself back in my schooling days, you know? Shy. Quiet. Yeah. Always had her nose buried in a book. She seemed to appreciate my company, though. She, enjoyed the vase of red roses I placed on her bedside table as a welcome gift. A few days later, when Phoebe was settled in and happy, there was a knock on the door. Phoebe opened the door to find a young man standing there. He had a chiseled, smooth face, olive skin, and big black eyes. He was dressed casually in a gray hoodie and cargo shorts. "Hi there," he said cheerfully. "I'm your new neighbor, Danny. It's nice to meet you." Phoebe blushed. There was something about Danny that just blew her away. Love at first sight. That's what they call it. She invited him inside, and they chatted over tea. Turned out they had a lot of the same interests. They liked a lot of the same books. I hated Danny. He was the Prince Charming no one really needed. I did everything in my power to make him feel unwelcome. I misplaced his things. I thwarted his plans to spend time with Phoebe by messing up his schedule. I even sent fake text messages to him from his parents. But despite my best efforts, Phoebe gradually fell under his spell some more. Every night, she would sigh as she stared at photographs of him or them spending time together. He was over at dinner every day, and sometimes they would even sleep together, intertwining like a nest of baby snakes. To make it even worse, Danny seemed to have noticed my presence over time. And he didn't like me either. He started burning sage and incense around the house. He chanted prayers to make me go away. He consulted mediums and held seances. Danny even encouraged Phoebe to participate in them, and together they would sprinkle salt around the house. With his continued efforts, I gradually grew weaker and weaker. I could no longer watch over Phoebe. I could only watch helplessly as Danny finally stabbed Phoebe with a big knife, grinning like a maniac. Warm blood trickled out of her chest and towards the floor, just as he had done to me 10 months before. Teaching Me Order by GarnetAndOpal. I tug at my earlobe and let you know I am about to tell you my story. When I was young, I got so excited by crafting tales, I just couldn't tell them in the right order. I would get the beginning fairly well, but the whole middle would be jumbled. I would jump ahead, skip back, remind my listeners that I would explain something in a minute. And sometimes I got the end a little mixed up. I got all the parts of the story in, but it was a messy affair. In a normal place, at a normal time, that would be seen as a youthful person trying to get all the details out and not realizing how the sequence mattered. But it was not a normal time, nor was it a normal place. My mother and I were story guilders. Even though I was but 8 years around the sun, I was supposed to be at journeyman level. The elders of the Tale Crafting Guild came to our house one evening. They told me that they would teach me to tell my stories in the right sequence. I was a little nervous, because I hated being wrong, but I was excited that they were going to advance me in my craft. I didn't know how they would do it. I shield my eye before telling you the rest. They cut off my mother's left ear. That was first. They made me say it. Mother's left ear is first. They pulled out her right eye with a wooden spoon. That was second. I had to say, Mother's right eye is second. Then they cut my mother's little fingers off, both hands, at the same time. The fingers were third. Mother's little fingers are third. I was informed that, I was informed that if I needed another lesson in sequence of events, they would next take her tongue, her liver, and her heart. There would not be a third lesson. If by then I had not learned, I would be the training tool for any other tale-crafty journeyman who needed a lesson. When the elders left, my mother and I clung to each other. Even to this day, when I start telling a story, I pinch my left ear. Starting the middle of the journey, I put my hand over my right eye. And when I get to the end, I link my little fingers together. I pull my little fingers tight against each other. My friends, that is the end of the story. Nobody Wants to Go Near Me Anymore by Polly Ann. People used to like me. They'd sit next to me on a park bench. They'd smile when they saw me. They were completely comfortable bringing their girlfriends and kids around me. Not anymore. Not since that awful murder. Now they cross the street to avoid me, and if they do look at me, it's only with a look of disgust. I wish I could tell them all how sorry I was,
Sure, nobody blames me. It's not my fault. They know it wasn't my fault, but now they can't stand to even glance my way. I'm so lonely. What I wouldn't give to have someone sit down for lunch with me. I took the little things like that for granted for so long. I had to watch him die. They hanged him and left before he was even dead. I was the one that saw the life leave his eyes, saw the pain and desperation on his face, and I couldn't do a thing to help him. Those terrified eyes will haunt me for the rest of my life. I wanted nothing more than to reach out and save him. Point the police to the murderers and see those awful men put in jail for the rest of their lives. But I couldn't. I'll never be able to. I can't control where my branches bend, and my leaves can only rustle and whisper in the wind.
I got paid heavily to organize a rich family's closet, but I had to follow really weird conditions. By long story short, let me just begin by saying that paper towels are expensive. It's one of those epiphanies that you tend to have as your items are scanned and your heart dips while noticing you've blown a quarter of your paycheck on a week's worth of groceries. As if choosing a career in creative arts was not taxing enough. On the bright side, people in LA were rich, stupid rich, which meant that the odder your job was, the more you got paid. Closet organization came naturally to me, and thanks to Marie Kondo, this little side business I set up helped me get through most tough days. A friend had recently hooked me onto a website where you could list your services to reach the elite of the elite. That's when I got an offer from an Audrey Salinger that I could not resist. She had left her contact number in the message saying it was a highly paid gig and that she could not reveal more details until I agreed. I picked up my phone and dialed her number. "Hi, you've reached Audrey Salinger?" A delicate voice came through on the second ring. "Oh, hey, yeah, this is Karina from the Closet Organization ad. I saw your message." "Karina, I'm so glad you called," she interrupted, her tone changing almost instantly. I didn't have to speak more as she delved right into the details. Audrey worked for the Montgomerys, whose house required quite a bit of refurbishing, and she'd like to start with the closet. It all seemed fine until she mentioned she had one condition. "It would be preferable if you finished it in one night. You can stay over if need be," Audrey spoke. I was a little taken aback to respond, feeling uneasy about the proposal. I wasn't ready to make her a promise that I could not follow through without knowing what I was dealing with. $3,000. Audrey's voice interrupted my thoughts, thrice the amount listed on the website. "I'll pay you $3,000 if you spend the night, and I'll do it. I'll get it done," I told her. I wasn't going to let this opportunity slip by. "Great. I'll text you the rest of the details. Thank you. Audrey cut the call without a second to waste. I woke up early the next day, ready to get a head start on the laborious task that lay ahead. I pulled into the driveway of the address texted to me by Audrey. It was nothing less of a mansion. She had instructed me to let myself in with the key, dropped in the mailbox. It amazed me how nonchalant the rich were when it came to safety. I found the key along with an envelope addressed to me. I opened it to find the dollar bills, 3,000, as promised, along with a letter. Carefully placing the money inside my bag, I pinched myself to ensure I was not dreaming. I opened up the letter. Dear Karina, I'm sorry I was not able to personally meet you as something came up, but please refer to the following instructions below. 1. You are to only clean the second room on your right downstairs. All other rooms will remain locked. 2. Lock yourself once you're inside, and do not open the door if you hear a knock, no matter how many times you hear it. 3. If you find the dollhouse while cleaning, make sure to cover it with the white bed sheet. The dolls need to sleep. Please do not forget this. Help yourself to anything in the fridge. The bed's rolled out on the living room sofa. Signed, Audrey. I read the letter twice, wondering if she was trying to be funny with her 2 rules. I placed the letter into my bag and let myself in, immediately locking the door behind me. I was not one to break the rules, especially if it came with a shit ton of money. The grandeur of the Montgomery's mansion swept me off my feet. It took me 30 minutes to pick my jaw off the floor and get to work. The second room on my right was a walk-in closet, piled with all sorts of things. I believed it belonged to a Mrs. Montgomery, as most of the items resembled what would belong to a middle-aged woman. I rolled up my sleeves and got down to it, cleaning, folding, stacking, labeling, only taking a quick half-hour break in between for lunch to grab a sandwich I found in the fridge. I made a mental note to reach home and Google what line of business the Montgomerys were in to afford all this. When I came back, ready to tackle yet another section, I noticed a huge dollhouse, one that slipped my attention before. It was a replica of the very mansion I was in, down to the nth detail. Every room, every tile so meticulously designed. There were 4 miniature figures placed in a different room of the house. I assumed it was the family that currently paid for my 2 months' rent. I didn't dare touch the dollhouse. Worried if I even chipped it a little, it would cost me a kidney. I dove right back to work, letting the hours pass me by. It was 11 p.m. as I placed the last pair of stilettos on the shelf. Too exhausted to even eat, I shut the lights out and closed the door behind me, crashing on the living room couch. I was deep asleep when I was awakened by the knocking. I checked my phone to see that it was almost 2 a.m. The airiness of it all finally caught up to me as I began to imagine the worst-case scenarios in my head. I began to regret signing up for this. The knocking got faster, and I shut my eyes trying to zone it out. I woke up the next morning to the sound of clanking pans from the kitchen. I realized I had overslept due to my exhaustion. I walked into the kitchen to find a man and a woman similar to the dolls I saw. "Good morning. You must be Karina." Mrs. Montgomery flashed a bright smile. "I love what you've done with the closet. Looks so much more compact." "Oh, thank you. I didn't know you were here," I spoke, too embarrassed to present my disheveled morning face. "Oh, yes. We found an early flight back from the Bahamas. Kids couldn't wait to get home. Why don't you join us for breakfast?" I sat down on one of the high chairs as the two kids rushed in. After helping myself to a scrumptious meal, I said my goodbyes, after thanking them at least a couple of 100 times. On my drive back, with only 5% battery left, I quickly texted Audrey that the job was done and that I also had the pleasure of dining at the Montgomerys. As soon as I reached home, I jumped into the shower and plugged my dead phone in. I could feel the fatigue leaving my body as the hot water hit. I couldn't help but sing out loud, ecstatic about how this gig went. My bathroom concert was interrupted by a knocking on my front door. I turned off the water and wrapped myself with a towel. "Give me a minute," I yelled as I hurried to get dressed. My phone screen flashed. 15 missed calls from Audrey. 4 texts. The knocking began again. "In a second." I read the texts. "Karina, pick up my call. Did you leave the house? Tell me you left." I couldn't understand Audrey's panic as I scrolled through her texts. "Karina, did you forget to cover the dollhouse?" I couldn't recollect. I figured I must have forgotten because of how tired I was. The knocking on my door came faster, more furious now. "The Montgomerys died in a plane crash 2 years ago. Trip back from the Bahamas." I clutched my phone tight in my hands as I read those lines. My stomach dipped, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. If the Montgomerys died 2 years ago, who did I have breakfast with today? I felt my ears get hot, the knocking fading into the background as my own heart beat louder. The dolls need sleep too. A feeling of dread watched over me as I realized I didn't follow Audrey's instructions. I turned slowly towards my door, the knocking suddenly reminding me of last night at the mansion. My phone buzzed. A new text. My hands shaking beyond control as I opened to read. "Do not open your door." My grandmother left me the secret to her famous recipe when she died. Written by Long Story Short. My grandmother has always been that lady. The youngest of 3 sisters, she marched to her beat to make ends meet in a low-income household. Despite growing up in a typical Indian household, in a town that you can't even identify on a map, Mimi's name would be hailed for generations to come. The town held a strong belief that a female warrior kept them all in check. It was a story that was told to misbehaving children to finish up their dinner. Well, some dismissed it as a legend. Some garnered the belief that the warrior now lives through Mimi. It was the only explanation for the sudden disappearance of bad men who would intrude the peace of the village. The old and the wise claimed that 15-year-old Mimi had taken her warrior form and chased them away for good. Mimi would laugh in response, silencing any questions that would come her way. While these mysterious tales subsided, but not completely diminished, every summer that I spent in Mimi's ancient house, I'd learn something new about her from the many stories I'd hear. I had learnt she once caught a live snake at the age of 12 in the backyard and tossed it to safety. That she was part of a traveling circus in her teens. But the most interesting of them all was how she used to throw these grand soirees randomly, where the highlight was her world-famous beetroot pudding, aptly named by my grandpa. I remember waking up to the smell of roasted cashews on the mornings of her parties. The kitchen would always stay shut. Mimi never liked to be disturbed through her process. 3 hours later, she'd bring the goodness in a glass bowl, and I'd get the privilege of the first bite. How does it always taste so great? What is the secret? I'd beg. She'd pinch my cheek. Love. She'd smile. I sighed at her stereotypical answer. Dil se. From the heart in Hindi. Straight from the heart. It was the same answer every time. And I began to accept that the chef always has his secrets. When I was 19, her health slowed down. I stayed beside her in bed, watching the many visitors say their farewells, seeking her blessings. Once they had all left, she reached out for my hand. I extended, surprised at the cold, metallic object placed in my palm. It was a key, rusty and old, unlike the others used in the house. She pulled me close, kissed my forehead, and whispered, "The secret is in the kitchen garage." She passed away the next day. I held on to the key until we saw through her proceedings. I told my parents I'd be staying an extra day. And after they left, I went to the kitchen and opened the storage. It had a single light bulb. The corner of it looked like a door, where the key fit perfectly. I pushed it open, almost losing my balance at what seemed to be a staircase. At first, it was the stench. I covered my nose and walked down, holding out the flashlight from my phone. the smell getting worse as I reached the bottom. I stepped on something soft, wet. I shone the light in front of me. Bodies. Dozens of them, tossed one on top of the other, like meat in a butcher shop. I controlled the bile that came up my throat as I ran out of the basement. 1,000 questions swirled around as I dialed the number of the local police station. It bewildered me that someone as lively as Mimi would be even remotely related to something gruesome as this. I set out on the porch steps, barely paying attention to the swarm of doctors and policemen investigating the house. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears as I saw the stretches with dead bodies carried out, one after the other. Hours later, one of the policemen requested to talk personally to gather details about the series of events. I explained everything from Mimi's last moments to the discovery of the cellar. These bodies, some of them are over 40 years old, he explained. I could feel my stomach turn again. We could only identify one for now. He wasn't even one of our own. He was a miscreant from the nearby village, he continued. The tales about the female warrior surrounded my head. They were true to some extent, after all. And Mimi held this secret all her life. Peculiar thing. There's a common pattern in all of them, the officer stated. He asked me to brace myself as he uncovered the white sheet covering one of the corpses. There it was, a gaping hole on the left side of the chest, right where the heart used to be. They're all missing their hearts. I felt my body go numb. Love. I heard Mimi's voice in my head. Dulce. Straight from the heart. What did I see? Written by BloodySpaghetti. I don't know if this fits here. All right, but I've got to get this off my chest. This night, it's been a nightmare. It's not enough that I couldn't fall asleep again. Now this. I don't even know what to call it, man. I don't even know. Excuse the tone, but I'm just. I can't keep myself steady just yet. None of this makes any sense, and I'm sorry, but I'm likely to be rambling like a madman. I might be one after what I just saw tonight. And this wasn't any sleep. There wasn't in the last 3, no, maybe 4. I don't even know, man. I haven't slept in a few days. Lost track of time. I can't think straight. Just so many. God, none of this makes sense. sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. My head hurts. Jesus, I'm so tired. Yet my mind won't stop racing, and I can't sleep. I can't afford to sleep. I'm stuck. I'm just stuck thinking about everything over and over and over again. I can't slow down. My heartbeat, I can hear that in the walls. I can hear the screams of the banshees outside, just out of my window. It's probably just my mind playing tricks on me due to the lack of sleep. I don't know. I'm so tired. Excuse Excuse the mess. Smashing the keys on the keyboard seems to be relaxing. I need that right now. Ignore it. Might as well ignore everything I say, because it could have all been just a lucid dream or something. I don't even know. It sure did feel like a dream. Uh, Maybe I was just hallucinating the whole thing. I don't remember getting back home even. All I remember vaguely is that I left, but I don't remember coming back home. What if I never left? I'm losing my fucking mind here for sure. I think no. I think I went outside for a walk. I usually do that when I can't sleep. I don't know, it helps me to relax enough to finally collapse. There's a forest not far from here. It's perpetually peaceful and has a serene quality about it. And last night it started off that way. Then it all shit hit the fan. Man, I was walking around the forest, enjoying the barely lit environment, when I heard something akin to a cry or something. At first, I ignored the nosy and kept on walking. I thought it might be my mind playing tricks on me over a call of some animal or something. I don't know. I just kept wandering around the forest, just soaking in the clean air, away from the industrial urban area. It was calming, but that crying noise, it persisted like a high-pitched cry mixed in with whisper and a soft moan. I don't know how to even describe it properly, but just thinking about it just makes my skin crawl. Oh. It's just somehow I found myself following the noise. I ended up following it for a while before I found the source, or what I thought to be the source, at least. A person. A person is sitting against a tree. It's hard to continue. Uh, I want to get out of my system, but I can't. I want to get out of my system, but I can't. I want to get out of my system, but I can't. I want to get it out of my. I want to get it out of. I want it out of my stupid fucking. I want to get it out of my. I want it. I want it.
Excuse the mess. My chest, it's tightening. I feel like shit. I don't know if I'll be able to finish this. I'm so tired. It's so much pain. It's hard to keep my eyes open. But when I close them, I see that thing all over again. I'm in hell. I wish there was a way to get rid of this insomnia without blowing my brains out. The pills don't do shit. I might research something later. I saw that person pressed against a tree and shone my flashlight on their body. They were covered in some sort of a rag. I called out to them, but they didn't respond. They didn't even utter a sound. Time seemed to stand still as I pondered for a moment whether I should nudge them or not. I gave into the impulse and pulled the rag. My blood froze and my stomach twisted itself into knots. I stumbled backwards and threw up all over before falling down. My eyes stayed locked on that thing. It was a person, all right. But the neck and the chest were torn open, relieving the bloody insides. I feel it again. I'm going to throw up. Nearly threw up all over myself again. God. As I sat there just staring at that mutilated corpse, I noticed just how decayed the face of this person had been. It was sickly green and bloated. Flies and maggots crawled all over where the eye sockets. I swear it was the worst sight I've ever seen. I swear it was the worst sight I've ever seen. I was enchanted by this awful apparition before me, unable to unglue my eyes away from it, as if I was afraid it might spring to life and try to tear my head off. After God knows how long I've sat there, like something fell from the tree above. Something huge. Nearly crashed my leg, but I managed to roll away and fall down a small hill. I heard this awful scream, like a high-pitched, wavering, pathetic attempt at a roar. It was something that would have come out of a chimp's mouth if chimps could roar, and yet not quite as big as a gorilla. It was absolutely ridiculous, but the thing that made it wasn't. At the moment, I nearly suffered a heart attack when I heard that scream. My heart was trying to beat its way out of my chest cavity. On autopilot, I crawled back up the hill, I don't even know why. Maybe I just wanted to make sure what I was seeing was real. In front of the tree stood a massive human being, or maybe it wasn't a human. I don't even know. It was tall, probably over 2 meters tall. Just something my dad might have worn back in the 80s or so. I couldn't make out its facial features. The face was covered in thick black mane. He just stood there, perfectly still. My blood ran cold. My chest was exploding with pain. My whole body just was screaming at me to get out of there, but my mind kept me locked in place. It was aware of me. And it knew it. It knew I was there. It knew I was watching it. It was watching me, studying me. 1 second it was still as a statue, and the next it was racing like a fucking lion straight at me. I thought I was going to die, so I closed my eyes and started praying. I heard its massive footsteps getting closer. It was on top of me before I could even notice, and then I felt something brushing the top of my head before my body collapsed downwards again. I have no fucking clue what happened after that. Yes, I don't remember anything. I don't remember. How did I... How did I get home? I don't know. I just don't know what I saw. I called the cops, barely managed to tell them what happened. Nearly got into trouble myself. They said they'll be looking for whatever that thing I saw out there, and I'm not sure if I want to believe them. What did I even see out there? I'm so tired. I want to sleep. My chest hurt. Why is my hair sticky? I want to sleep. Letting my eyes close, I see that ugly, elongated, hairy, fang-filled mug. It's so fucking ugly, and it smells like rotten, wet soil. I hope I managed to fall asleep at least.
My cop husband found a cursed statue at a crime scene. Written by twocantherapper. I knew when I married him that Don was a good man, but not a smart one. That's partly why I loved him. It's also why he was such a good fit for the Marathon County Sheriff's Department. Kind-hearted, followed orders, too happy obeying to ask questions. Exactly what you want in a cop. I fell in love with Don for a lot of reasons. He always stood up straight, always showered twice a day, ironed every damn shirt he wore. He was a proud man. And it was those little things he was proud of that I found so damn adorable. Gentle, too. Never raised a hand to anyone unless he absolutely had to. What didn't matter to me was that Don had never been the sharpest knife in the rack. I always knew Don wasn't smart. I didn't think he was stupid. I learned how wrong I was when he came home one night with that damn statue. When I asked him why on earth he'd bring evidence from a crime scene home in the first place, he told me he didn't know. I was sympathetic at first, you know. Not angry, not terrified like I am now. I thought he'd been unable to part with it because of some kind of post-traumatic stress. And like I said, my Don was kind-hearted. Soft was the word my father, who definitely isn't kind-hearted, used. That's another part of what made Don such a good cop in these parts, though. He needed softness when settling violent disputes between drunk couples or picking up strung-out tweakers from the curb all day. Especially when every perp knew you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper. Marathon County ain't the kind of place where nights like the one he found the statue happened. It was a triple homicide. Don had dealt with his share of murders, but never a multiple body count. I saw how rattled he was as soon as he damn near fell through the door. I'd been married to him for 8 years, dating for 6 before that. High school sweethearts. That old chestnut. In none of those 14 journeys round the sun had I ever seen my man so pale, so shaking, so distraught. You know them photos of the World War II soldiers with the 1,000-yard stare? Yeah. If you do, you've seen the look my Don had on his face that night. He didn't say anything to me the entire evening. He sat down, put the statue on the table, downed a glass of water, then went to bed. Not one single word in my direction. Didn't even meet my damn gaze. I didn't find out from Don what happened, but from his boss, Sheriff Harworst, an old family friend, as most folk around here are. Harworst painted a grim picture over the landline. Don had answered a call about a domestic disturbance from one of the other apartments in that complex. He'd arrived to find the door to the crime scene, apartment 19, hanging from its hinges. You could smell the blood in the hallways, apparently. But did Don stop and call for backup? No, he didn't. Not my Don. Daddy called him soft, but Daddy was an idiot. Don was kind, warm, had no roughness to his edges. What he didn't lack, though, was balls. That's another reason I loved him. He had, metaphorically speaking, the biggest cojones I'd ever known to a man to swing. A gentle, fearless giant. So yeah, I had no reason to doubt Harworth's recount of Don running into the apartment, firearm raised, ready to save a life, end one, or probably both. Harworth didn't arrive until later, after Don didn't radio back. They sent the whole armed unit. They feared the worst, but what they got was, well, it was worse than any worst folk round here usually imagine. Don hadn't answered because he was curled in the fetal position in one corner of the studio apartment. I'd never seen Don cry. Men round these parts don't, generally speaking. I didn't believe that part of Harworth's story until he described the carnage he found Don amongst. As I said, it was a triple homicide. Don't ask me who done it, because They still ain't caught the sixth son of a bitch. The victims were all male. All tweakers, too, most likely, given the neighborhood Don found them in. Finding 3 bodies would have shut anyone up. And that's the truth. But Don was a cop. 3 bodies in and of themselves ain't usually enough to rattle cops. Especially ones with a few years under his belt like he had. No. It wasn't finding 3 bodies that rocked my husband worse than I'd ever seen. It's what had been done to them before they died. The sick bastards who killed them had made some alterations. That's how Horworth described it to me, before I'd sworn at him so much he gave up being coy about details. I must admit, I still regret browbeating him into the full truth. He's a good man. And by the time I put down the phone, I realized he hadn't been trying to withhold anything from me, as some kind of commentary on the emotional fragility of my gender. He didn't want to talk it out in full because he was shit-ass scared too. It was impossible to identify the victims for a simple reason. They'd had their faces removed. The killer had stripped back the flesh until nothing but bone and muscle remained. They'd been thorough, too. Tongues, jaws, teeth, eyes, and noses. Almost everything that wasn't the skull itself had been carved off. The wounds weren't clean either. They were jagged. Ripped. The kind of wounds made slowly and painfully by a blade far too blunt for butchery. Horworth's vivid description of the meatless skulls was in itself enough to buckle my knees so bad I had to sit down. His recollection didn't stop there, though. The faceless corpses had been positioned kneeling in a circle, facing inwards. At its center was a compost heap of scraps of skin, bone, muscle, teeth, hair, eyes, all the offshoots and trimmings left over post-mutilation. Other parts had been removed, too. Every finger and toenail had been pulled out. Hamstrings had gouged out and discarded to keep them immobile. There were also gaping holes between each of their legs. You don't need schooling in criminology to figure the message behind leaving your man as anatomically endowed as a Ken doll. The swollen bruising around the castration wounds meant they'd been made when they were alive, by Horworth's reckoning. He also reckoned the horizontal gashes across each of their stomachs weren't made post-mortem either. Disemboweled ain't a word I have expected to hear in Marathon County, not on our side of the TV screen, at least. The offcuts and offal from every wound and opening had been added to the mound of gore. I nearly puked when Horworth told me there was enough of it stacked up to reach his waist. The walls of the studio apartment were caked in blood. Every bit of furniture was smashed, most thrown across the room, judging from the dents and holes in the cheap plaster walls. A CD player had been left on, playing Gustav Holst's Mars on repeat, which Horworth sheepishly admitted he had to cross-reference to the track number against the list on the CD case to figure. They'd found Don curled in a ball amongst the carnage, sobbing at the incomprehensible violence and destruction around him. Horworth sent him straight back to the station to shower and head home. That's why he was calling to check in. The sheriff didn't know about the statue. I figured at the time it would be best to keep it that way. Christ. Maybe Don wasn't the only idiot in this house. We didn't talk about the statue until the next morning. I didn't even register it that first night. My husband had come home traumatized by an event so horrific. I was traumatized just from listening to someone recount the traumatic details. That's 3 levels of trauma I was dealing with. Trauma cubed. Excuse me for caring more about my man's emotional well-being than some trinket he stole. I fell asleep, holding Dawn while listening to him quietly sob. It was the first and only time I'd ever been the big spoon. He wasn't in my arms when I awoke. I found him downstairs, sat at the kitchen table, staring at the statue. That's when I noticed it properly for the first time. It was placed atop the mound of viscera when Dawn found it. It was made of a material that resembled jade, if jade was the bright orange of magma. It didn't feel like jade to the touch either. Despite looking smooth and polished, it felt rough. Rough doesn't feel like quite the right word, though. Charged is more appropriate. Almost like it felt how battery acid tastes. The statue of 2 men standing back to back. They were, to put it delicately, huge. They were a level of swollen that nobody could argue was healthy, attractive, or in any way a shape human beings were meant to be. Their stomachs sagged to their knees, ankles folded around feet so tumor-like that the stubby toes poking from beneath them were barely visible. There was no part of them that didn't sag, bulge, or droop, and all of it had been captured in hideously accurate detail by the sculptor. Every pore was visible, every hair-thin wrinkle and fold of skin plain to see. If the subject matter weren't so damn unsettling, I'd have said it was one of the best bits of art I'd ever seen. The sculptor hadn't given the orange jade men faces. They had heads, sure, but both were depicted wearing tight bags or sacks that obscured their features. What wasn't obscured were the painfully tight-looking lengths of barbed wire wrapped around the bags. Just looking at it made my face itch, my insides queasy. And as I said, Don was staring at it when I found him downstairs. I asked him about it, and he said he didn't know why he picked it up. Shock, he reckoned. He couldn't stop thinking about it last night, he told me. The statue, not the incident. At the time, I figured the statue fixation was some kind of coping mechanism. I know better now. I was gentle the first time I told him to take it back to the station. Reminded him kindly that having it was technically illegal. But given the circumstances, Sheriff Harworth was sure to look the other way. Don agreed to take it back later that day, when he went down to the station to file his report of the previous night's incident. Now he was calmer. For the rest of that first week, I genuinely believed that was the last I'd say of it. Then the weekend came. Don and I had a Friday date night agreement that was sacrosanct. Had been since high school. I'd given him a fair bit of slack during that first week. He was despondent, withdrawn, and distant. Again, I put it down to the trauma. It's the exact reason I picked his favorite restaurant, Mac's Steak and Brat's Smackdown Buffet, for our meal. To cheer him up. And because he knew I hate Mac's Steak and Brat's Smackdown Buffet with a passion. You can imagine my anger when I was left waiting there like a jilted high school kid for 3 hours. I was willing to look past a lot, but failing to follow Friday night date night tradition wasn't on that list. Don was supposed to meet me straight from work, as he did every week. I'm sure you can imagine how much calling to find he wasn't there further stoked my it. The final nail in my rage coffin was where I finally did find him. More specifically, what I found him with. He was sitting at his desk in his study. You can probably already guess what I caught him doing. Staring at that damn statue. Don didn't jump, didn't flinch, didn't even blink when I threw open the door. It took a good 10 minutes of me yelling at him for him to mumble an apology. No amount of berating can conjure an explanation for why he'd not gone to work that day, or where he'd gone after I heard him leave the house that morning. I gave up digging for a reason why he still had the statue after an hour or two. I felt bad after my outburst. Don had gone through a lot. And when I calmed down, I rationalized that I'd probably been unrealistic in my expectations of how quickly he'd bounce back. I apologized, and he agreed to return that statue and speak to Hallworst about some time off. I watched him take it with him in the car the next morning, just to be sure. Again, I thought that was the last I'd see of it. Don was still withdrawn and sullen for the next few weeks, but started to show flashes of his former self here and there. He didn't miss Friday night date night again. That's for damn certain. I'm not a snoop either, and I always like to give Don his privacy, but I have to admit I did search his study once or twice when he was at work during that first week, just to make sure he'd actually made good on his promise. By the time the night of the incident was about a month behind us, I'd almost thought we were getting back to normality. That's when I got the second call from Hallworst. Don hadn't returned to work since his week of recuperative leave. At first, I argued. I saw him leave the house every morning. I said, uniform and badge ready in his bag. It was when Hallworth started mentioning how easy it was to lose said badge that I stopped playing incredulous wife and started listening proper. I didn't ask about the statue. Both because I didn't want to get Don fired and because I already knew the answer. When Don got back from work, I was midway through tearing his study apart. He tried playing dumb at first, until I mentioned the call from Hallworst. He broke down at that, and confessed at least to his lies about his whereabouts. I took what he said then as the truth. I still feel like a fool about that. He told me he'd been in bars, drinking, that he couldn't forget about the incident. That's why he was so tired all the time, he told me. So withdrawn, so unfocused. I also bought the lie about him throwing the statue in a river. Oh no, I'm not giving myself enough credit here. I didn't believe him. I just wanted to. So much so that I made the unconscious decision to just leave it. To live in the fantasy land where my brave husband was a recovering alcoholic cop, despite never smelling of booze or spending a dime. It only took 2 nights for that fantasy to come crumbling down. I was woken by a crash outside our window. Nothing major, you understand. Probably just raccoons or the wind knocking some dead foliage our way. It was realizing that Don wasn't lying next to me that got my feet out of bed and treading as quiet as possible around the house. I heard him before I saw him. And because of that, I managed to see him without seeing me. I don't know what would have happened if he had. And I don't think I'd still be alive to write this. That's for damn certain. He was standing in the downstairs bathroom, facing the mirror. It was the look in his eyes that made tears instantly fall from my own. That collapsed my hand to my mouth to stifle a terrified whimper. I'd never seen that look on my Don's face. I'd never seen it on anyone's. Evil. It's not a word I ever thought I'd find myself using in seriousness or outside of church. That's the only one I have, though. Don never smiled with his teeth. His reflection was grinning so wide I could see all of them, even the molars. His normally narrow eyes were stretched to perfect bulging circles. Ventricles and veins pulsed on their surface, and his left eyelid twitched without warning in an erratic, arrhythmic pattern. His nostrils were flared, almost to the point of being level with his cheekbones. Brows raised until it crushed his forehead against his hairline. And the muscles and folds of the version of my Don in that reflection were stretched back so far that if I couldn't see the back of his head from my perch on the first floor landing, I'd have sworn someone was holding him upright by the back of his head. He was talking to himself, repeating a single word over and over. Till perfection. It's a word I'm all too familiar with now. But that night it raised nothing but terrified confusion. He was dragging his razor across the mirror like he was trying to shave the face on the other side of it. Over and over he dragged the blades across the glass. The squeaks and scrapes set my teeth on edge and vertebrae of my spine to shudder. I couldn't stand to watch for more than a few minutes. As I said, the only word I have, is evil. It wasn't light that danced in those bulging eyes. It wasn't the happy spark and joy I'd fallen in love with. What twinkled in Don's eyes tonight was a cold, dead lust. A lifeless urge for things too foul for you or I to comprehend. A small part of me wishes I'd been carrying my phone, that I'd taken a photo. Unless you saw those eyes for yourself, the above probably doesn't make sense. In fact, I kind of hope it doesn't. If it does, and you've seen eyes like Don's, then your life is already, or about to be, as fucked as mine. I couldn't sleep that night. I couldn't sleep that night. When Don eventually came back to bed a few hours later, I just lay trembling in the dark, waiting until his snoring started to burst into stifled sobs. I left him a note when he went out the next morning. Told him he needed to sort his shit out and that I was going to stay with my sister to clear my head. I couldn't tell him the real reason I wanted to get out of there. That I couldn't close my eyes without seeing a version of his face so terrifying it made the thought of being around him induce a panic attack. A week went by before I started to get worried about the fact he hadn't called. After a while, I started to think that I'd maybe been half asleep when I saw him, or that I dreamt it. God, I wish that were the fucking case. Once more, my negativity turned inward, and I started beating myself up over my overreaction. Don was unwell, and I'd abandoned him, I told myself. I was a terrible wife. I'd left him alone when he needed me most. My sister didn't share my view. She had made me promise not to go back to him groveling, not to make the first move, not to be the one that reaches out to break the ice. I broke that promise on Saturday morning by phoning Dawn, and broke it again when I went home upon the call going straight to voicemail. It had been a week since I'd last stood in my living room. Looking at the state of it, Don had abandoned it himself not long after. The whole house was trashed. Every piece of furniture had been pulled apart or thrown across the room. In some cases, taken to with a sledgehammer by the looks of things. There were splatterings of blood here and there, pools of it forming around sharp metal edges and splintered wood where he'd pulled furniture and appliances apart with his bare hands. My tears started silently falling almost the exact moment I crossed the threshold into our once beautiful home. I couldn't allow myself to believe my Dawn. My gentle, caring Dawn was capable of this level of wanton destruction, this carnage. I wouldn't believe it. I had to tiptoe over broken glass, wood, and plaster in almost every room. A thick cloud of dust sprang from wherever my foot fell, and there wasn't a single room that didn't stink of urine, rotten food, or both. He'd done that too, you see. He'd done it on our upturned couch, on the inside of our beaten-in fridge, and in the drawer where I kept our wedding photos. My tears weren't silent as the mental images grew more and more vivid. Each room gave enough new evidence for my imagination to make an ever clearer montage of Don, with his bulging eyes and tooth-filled grin, ripping apart the life we'd built together in the most destructive, most barbaric way he possibly could. This was not my Don. It couldn't be. But it was. It was his study that broke me. When I found it, I could do nothing but fall to my knees and weep. Unlike the rest of the house, the study was more or less intact. And here it seemed Don had decided to create rather than destroy. He'd built himself an effigy on his desk. A crude replica of two large, back-to-back figures I recognized immediately. I can't breathe. Jesus. I can't bring myself to write what he made them out of. My Don might be well, he might be the reason all this happened. But I care enough for my memory of him that I won't conjure the mental image of him using his bare hands to make a sculpture out of, out of the other kind of body waste. I could smell it. As soon as I reached the upper floor landing, it wasn't the disgustingness of it that pushed the last of my composure from me. No, it was the mental image of my once proud Don, of the bestial, primal, horrific thing he'd become. It was the thought of the man I'd admired above all others, broken, wretched, and weak. Despite my terror and anger at our destroyed home, all I wanted to do was help him. I was about to phone the only person I could think of, Hallworst, when something on Don's desk made me pause. It was a receipt for a storage unit on the edge of town. I knew the address. A friend of ours kept some of her ex-husband's stuff there after a messy divorce. I shouldn't have listened to my gut. It was my gut that told me not to phone Hallworst. It was my gut that told me to put my phone away, to go downstairs and get back in the car. It was my gut that convinced me I could help Don, that I could get through to him, and that once I found him at the storage unit, we'd reconcile and he'd get better, and that all this could be put behind us. If anyone tells you to always trust your gut, don't listen to him. It was easy to find which of the few dozen storage units Don had rented. It was late by the time I arrived, and it was the only one in the lot with a light on. Even if it hadn't been, the wiry old man in the booth was more than happy to throw the spare set of keys at me once I explained who I was. That creepy damn guy with the bulging fucking eyes had come to visit his unit a few days back, and none of the booth attendants had seen him leave. When I questioned why the police hadn't been called already, the man in the booth scratched his chin, looking sheepish. They were scared of him. Too scared to phone the cops. Seems ridiculous, right? It wouldn't if you'd seen his face in the mirror that night like I had. To me, the attendant's fear made perfect sense. I asked when the creepy guy, when Don, first took out rental on the unit. The wiry man told me it had been a few weeks prior, coinciding with the day Don had thrown the damn statue in the river. Obviously, I'd blinkered myself to a lot that I should have seen coming, but I wasn't foolish enough to still believe that lie. As much as it made my stomach plummet, I knew that when I found Don, the orange jade effigy would be with him. I thanked the wiry attendant before heading in the direction of Don's unit. The man in the booth seemed sympathetic. He let me know gently but firmly that if I wasn't back in an hour, he would phone the police. Said he couldn't rest with my death on his conscience, no matter how scared of that creepy fucking tweaker he was. I didn't argue. Don's unit, Unit 19, was at the very edge of the lot. I couldn't hear anything except for the distant groan of traffic and the faint crinkle of a chain-link fence scratching the wind as I approached it. It was a cold night. This wasn't unusual with it being November, but for some reason I became acutely aware of it in the near silence. I could feel, hear, and see my rapid, shallow breaths. I managed to get at least 6 into each footstep, the fog of my lungs' warmth billowing from my lips. The handle to the door of Unit 19 was cold too, but much colder than the air. It was the kind of frigid that meant it almost burned to the touch. If my fingers weren't already trembling when they wrapped around it, they would have been by the time I'd finished turning. The units themselves were quite spacious as far as storage units go. Each had 2 rooms, a short hallway where one entered, and accessible via an inner door at the hallway's other end was the storage area. The storage area had a rolling garage door to allow goods in and out of course, but this could only be opened from the inside. It was for the inner door that I needed the key. The walk from the inside door to the other end of the hallway was one of the longest of my life, mainly because in here I could hear Don. He was bawling, not crying or sobbing, bawling like a toddler that had lost its parents, and not in the at the grocery store way. It was completely unrestrained in a way that I don't think I've ever heard an adult, man or woman, shed tears. It was a sound of pure despair. When you don't realize you're glad you've never heard until you do. The emotions that swelled in my chest when I heard it were as strong as they were complex. Sympathy, fear, disgust, care. The need to save and the need to flee started an intense battle within me the moment those sniveling wails hit my eardrums. Don's choking moans made the writing on the walls 100 times more unsettling, too. I'll tell you that for nothing. It must have taken him days. The same word across every inch of brick, over and over and over. You can probably guess the word already. Perfection. What that word meant to Don, I wouldn't know until the inner door to the garage area creaked open. I had to get there first. Even though the hallway was only about 10 feet in length, this was still a challenge. The cries and retches echoing off the dark bricks made putting one foot in front of the other a conscious effort. My mind wouldn't let me do anything but fixate on Dom's reflection in the mirror, those eyes filled with their cold, dead lust. With every foot, the distance between the second door and I shrank. The pictures behind my eyes grew more vivid. Over and over, my sadistic conscience replayed the reel of Don smashing our possessions, of him urinating on our wedding album, of him tearing apart our house until his hands bled. Tears were streaming down my face. Each one for the proud man I'd never known not to stand fully straight, and for the sniveling, hunched creature I feared he'd become. After the key clicked in the lock, and the door to the storage area swung open, I knew straight away that the levels of terror in my anticipation were nowhere near enough. The smell hit me in the face like a sack full of drowned rats. I actually took a step back, gagging, and trying to pull my shirt up over my mouth to cover my nostrils. It was the same stench Don had left in the house, but magnified 1,000-fold. There were new layers to it here, though. Layers of mold, of decay, of rotten meat. There was no light on the other side. Light from the grimy bulb in the hallway barely made it half a foot before the shadows consumed it. The stench wasn't the only thing that assaulted me from the shadows, though. With it came the flies. There were dozens of them, hundreds. If it hadn't been for Don's crying, I'd probably have heard their collective buzzing from the hall. I screamed, violently fanning my arms in front of me to stop any of the fat black buzzing lumps from finding their way into my mouth or nostrils. My anticipation was now a full-blown dread. Every artery thrummed from the sheer force of my frightened pulse. Fast, deep gulps oversaturated my brain with oxygen. Black spots started tickling the corners of my vision. Consciousness threatened to leave. My knees were midway to buckling when a realization slammed a fresh load of adrenaline through my veins. The moment I'd screamed, Don had stopped. I called out his name, but there was no answer. I could hear him in the darkness. He was standing somewhere on the other side of the room. His breaths were slow, heavy, and ragged enough to hear even over the horde of insects I'd freed when I opened the door. When he did answer, a further 2 times I found my fingers tightening around my phone, not to find help, but to find light. My palms were sweating so much that I nearly dropped the damn thing as I swiped my passcode onto the screen. My trembling index digit missed the button for the flashlight twice before finding it. The real screaming. The screaming that meant my ears were ringing for a solid week after that night started as soon as it did. The first thing the beam of phone light revealed was the floor. The concrete was caked in both bodily excretions the stench led me to expect, and large patches of dark red crust I recognized but really didn't want to. There were glistening chunks strewn across the floor, chunks of graying brown that wriggled with maggots. Some of the chunks had hair. Others had fingernails. One had a dead, glassy eye. In the corner of the room was the damn statue. The floor beneath it was clear, immaculate even. Don had taken great care to ensure that none of his mess, the destruction left in the wake of the man he'd become, touched it. I would have picked the damn thing up and smashed it right then, but I had another priority. Even though I knew I'd find them here, the 2 orange figures weren't who I came for. Don was standing at the other end of the room, facing the wall. The light crept up his naked, trembling body. Every inch climbed revealed a fresh wave of dread. My Don, who'd showered twice daily and took great pride in his self-maintenance, was caked in every substance splattering the floor. My beautiful Don, who'd never let himself slouch even an inch, now hunched over on a bent and crooked spine. My darling Don, covered head to toe in deep, pus-filled scratches, burns, and blisters. The full image of the back of his naked body was too much. I yelled something. I forget what. What I said isn't important. What's important is the sound of words coming from my own mouth startled me. Startled me so much that I dropped the damn phone. I was only in the dark for a few seconds. I dropped to my knees to search around in the muck almost before I'd heard the clattering squelch of it hitting the floor. And I found it in no time at all, pulling myself to my feet and pointing the light once more in front of me, straight into a pair of bulging dead eyes and a grin that showed every tooth. Somehow, I didn't repeat my clumsy mistake when I fell over backward. The phone stayed in my hand. The horror-revealing beam of light locked on the monstrous figure that was once my husband. Even hunched and crooked, he towered over me. The look in his eyes let me know what I needed to, that it was over. That it had been the moment he was unlucky enough to be the cop who answered the call to that damn apartment. I remember begging him to get it over with. For him to kill me and end this nightmare. He didn't say anything back. He just stood there, naked and caked in depravity, grinning down at me with that evil face. I wish I could say that it wasn't Don, but it was. Something in me knew that my Don, my beautiful Don, wasn't trapped by that face. It was his. No less so than the soft little half smile I fell in love with. He wasn't possessed. He hadn't been taken over or inhabited by some demonic entity. This was him now. This was my Don. This was what he'd become. What he always would be. In my mind's eye, I could see him pouncing. I tensed, ready to fight him off as he tried to tear me apart with his bare hands. The moment never came. Twisted as it sounds, part of me still wishes it had, all these years later. What he did instead was far, far worse. With a single fluid motion, Don reached with both hands and grabbed the back of his head, grinning down at me. Left eye twitching. He muttered one single word. Perfection. Then he pulled. My screaming had been caught in my throat while I was down on the floor with the dried blood, urine, and feces. It found its way back at Don's muscular forearms, wrenched his scalp. Even though my lungs were hitting decibels they never had, I could still hear the tearing. It started at his neck, a thin line of scarlet born on the bulge of his throat that flashed up to his jawline within a fraction of a second. The wet, crackling snaps of flesh prizing itself apart grew louder the further Don's arm stretched from his skull. His scalp, hair, and face went with him. I retched at the sight of his eyes rolling back in their sockets, vanishing from view as the face around them went limp and sagged. Within a few seconds, he dragged the skin off his head and clean off, sliding it from bone and muscle as easily as removing a hood. Exposed teeth, bulging, lidless eyes, gaping open nostrils. None of the nightmare-inducing anatomical horrors I'd expect were waiting for me under the facial skin Don tossed over his shoulder like a wet paper towel. This next part I know sounds impossible, and is the exact reason I've spent the last 5 years in St. Dionysus's home for the incurably mad. This scrap of paper might be the only chance I get to tell my story, though, and I'm not going to leave anything out. Underneath Don's freshly removed face were 2 heads, where one should have been. 2 squashed heads that writhed and undulated to separate themselves and inflate to their full size. 2 heads wrapped tight in orange plastic bags. Bags kept in place by constricting lengths of rusted barbed wire. I was already running to the door by that point, although my feet found it difficult to find purchase with the muck all over the floor. More than once I fell over in those few seconds before I finally found the hall. I got far too many glimpses of those two things clawing their way out of Don's body. Somehow he didn't buckle until the very end. The two barbed-wired crown lumps clawed and fought their way from his neck, both against Don's flesh and each other. His chest and torso bulged and stretched as they pulled more of themselves from whatever hell they'd risen from. I heard ribs crack as one of the orange-haired twins wrenched an arm free. The back of my neck felt warm wetness as the other one punched through Don's stomach with a gnarled foot. I shouldn't have done, but I couldn't stop myself from taking one last mortified look over my shoulder before I started running until they found me on the freeway 3 days later with bleeding feet. The two figures from the statue were standing above their likeness. Don was gone, completely eviscerated. I don't know how, and I don't know why, but they'd used him as some kind of portal or opening or gateway. I'd love to think that wasn't what he wanted, but I still remember that face. His face. I think that was his plan all along. The moment he found that statue, it had its hold on him. And I think this was always his end game. The two men he'd birthed into the world with his madness would have dwarfed him. Each was easily over 7 feet tall and nearly as wide. Even over the stench left by Don's activities, I could smell the rancid mucus that covered them, the acrid ammonia burning that oozed from them with each of their labored, bag-covered breaths. As I said, I wish I'd never looked back. Now every time I shut my eyes, the first thing I see is that image of them standing there, and the blood and shit and piss, and one of them raising their tumorous hand and pointing at me. The next few years are a blur. By the time the waking nightmares started to subside, I'd already been here at St. Dionysus for several years. I'd apparently been pretty difficult, let's say, during my time here. It's taken another few years for them to trust me with a pen. I've bribed one of the orderlies. He's going to get this out there, type it up, and put it online. Everyone thinks that I killed Don and all those people. I was too out of it to give my side of the story. I need to tell my side. I need people to know, need you to know what really happened. I don't want to say what I bribed him with. I don't have much. You can use your imagination. Please make it worth it. I need the world to know, not just because I'm innocent, but because those things, well, they're still out there. They have been all this time. If they could corrupt someone like my Don, make him do... None of you are safe. None of you. I hope the orderly makes good on his end of the bargain. I hope you get to read this. I was going to tell you my name, but there's no point. You don't believe me anyway, do you? I'll know my story's out there, and that's enough. I hope you get to read this because one day you might find a statue of 2 back-to-back men that feels like battery acid tastes. You might feel tempted to take that statue, to keep it. Even if you don't believe me now, when you find that statue, leave it be. Walk away from it. Pretend you never saw it and live your life. And if you see the two men with their bags and barbed wire, well, I'm sorry, but it's probably already too late.